Welcome back to another session. I hope you were well. In the session I covered previously, I made reference to mitochondria and how mitochondria plays a part and a significant role in the whole issue of depression and fatigue amongst people. In today's session, I'd like to build on that. I've mentioned over this series of videos spanning about 10 sessions prior that if you think about the physical part of the concept with regards to depression as being innately connected and intrinsically linked to energy, then it becomes much easier to, I guess, to diagnose and to understand when something could be wrong or could be off. I made reference to energy and ensuring you have a surplus state of energy rather than a deficit state in the body. The body generates energy. The body has to deliver that energy somehow to the various parts that require energy. And therefore, the way we deliver energy matters. Matching energy generation to energy delivery, therefore, is very, very important. If you're struggling with depression, there is intrinsically a high correlation between how you feel and the state you might find yourself in and an energy imbalance in your body, particularly on the physical side. Now, we haven't yet got to the mental, psychological or metaphysical aspect to the depression experience. But the key part is with regards to the physical is that if you match energy generation to energy delivery, what you have is something that works in balance. Therefore, in today's session, as I build on that concept, I want to talk about how this balance or imbalance is a function of certain parts of the functions in the body, but also the organs in the body, and how to ensure that you've dotted all the I's and you've crossed all the T's before you take that big leap towards the mental and the psychological side of things. But even more importantly, before you take that leap into pharma, big pharma, there's something called your survival value as a human being, and there's something called your thriving value as a human being. Whenever you match energy generation to energy demands, you're in a state of survival. So survival value is simply a concept whereby we try to match our energy demands to our energy delivery in a manner that brings upon a state of, you might say, resonance or a state of equilibrium. Therefore, you're surviving. You're producing enough energy to meet your demands. To go from survival to thrive, there has to be a shift. That shift is not materially huge, but the shift is simply saying your energy delivery has to be more efficient. But prior to that, your energy generation has to also be very efficient. And the key part of the whole process is that the energy spending has to be very, very effective and efficient. In the sessions I covered previously, I said, for most people, the whole concept of depression and fatigue and being anxious is a concept that most people feel intuitively, but cannot explain biologically. Sometimes, not always, sometimes the root cause could just be this imbalance in your energy state, primarily because of what you eat, your diet, the lack and the deficiency in certain supplements or nutritional supplements, and how your mitochondria functions. If your mitochondria is going slow, then you find you become lethargic and fatigued and distressed, and that feeds into the mind and you start to overthink things, and suddenly you find that you're not performing like you've always done. That worries you. Now, one of the things and I tend to use as a good example when I have conversations with people with regards to energies, is to think about how our forefathers and foremothers would have fared. Assuming you were in some part of Africa, you're not in the West, you're not walking down, Bond Street in central London, but you're in some African village. and a lion or a saber-toothed tiger jumped out immediately, made the huge roar. Instinctive thing for most people. Once you've got through that few seconds of fright, will be to run. People would run as though their lives depended on it, because it would. The presence of a saber-toothed tiger, the presence of a lion, the presence of a very dangerous beast, animal, will cause you to react instinctively. You go into flight mode, and you run so fast that sometimes when you get to your place of rest, destination, you often think, how did I actually cover such a distance in such a short piece of time frame? You see, the run requires maximal energy delivery. It's part of the reason why we're able to achieve that. Those who are very low energy, on the other hand, will struggle. They might find that it's difficult for them to react very quickly, because they don't have enough energy delivery to the various parts of the body that causes the body to switch into flight mode. Now, let's park that to one side, and let's look at the opposite side, which is when you're having a restful experience, whether that be a restful day, laying down, sunbathing, laying down and relaxing on holiday, not worrying about anything. One of the things we notice is our body starts to slow down. We move into a state of calmness and peace. Why? Partly because we're reducing our energy delivery, because we don't need that much energy. A state of peace, a state of chaos and uncertainty. And in between both of them is what we call the balance, which is why I talk about energy, the energy equation, and energy production, delivery, and use. The balance happens between those two contrasts. And one of the things I never knew, and perhaps this is something I'm sharing, is how the various organs in the body come into activity to enable us function between those two extremes. Now, life doesn't happen at the extremes, because that is not really life. Life happens somewhere in between. But we know very well, and you know as I do, that there are times when you gear up for perhaps a potential event. You're running a marathon, perhaps you have a competition, there's a deadline at work, and there are other times when you just have this peaceful moment. You're watching your favorite soap, you're resting on the beach, perhaps you're in a dark room, in a quiet room, you're meditating, and suddenly your energy delivery reduces. Sometimes, some people, the energy delivery maximizes itself once it gets to about, say, 6 p.m. on a Sunday evening. Why? The next day is work. The balance happens between both extremes, and the human body is designed to help you manage that process. We have what we call glands, adrenal glands and a thyroid glands, and these two act in a manner that enable us to gear up, to prepare, or to sustain any shock that comes our way. In the sessions that I covered previously, I made reference to how the human body works in the same manner as a car, and I remember using an analogy which I think has served me very well. It comes from the great doctor, who I think perhaps is the greatest teacher ever, certainly in the United Kingdom, and she explains how the body is like a car, and so you have the various parts of the car analogous to the various organs and functions in the body. And so we have what we call a gearbox that enable us to go from one gear to another so that we can pick up speed and so that the car moves in a fluid way. But also we have an accelerator pedal that allows us to pump more fuel, more oxygen into the mixing chamber that gives you more power, more energy. Now, you can pump in as much fuel as you can, and the car will move. But at some point, you've got to change gear. Otherwise, you start to burn certain parts of the car. This is partly why most people, you can find actually they can take a certain amount of stress, but they can't sustain that stress beyond the first day or the second day or the first week. they start to break down. Why? They haven't changed the gears. For those who are car enthusiasts, we have cars that can go from 0 to 60 within 2 seconds. We have cars that can go from 0 to 90 perhaps within 6 or 7 seconds. But the key part of that is if you are driving an automatic car, the car automatically changes gears for you. If you're driving a manual car, you have to change the gears yourself. Staying in the lower gear would work for a short period of time. Staying there for longer periods causes harm to the car. And so in balancing what happens between the extreme and the quiet, and why we find we struggle with regards to depression, either because we don't have enough energy to move from that quiet to the next stage, or partly because we find actually when we get into the quiet stage, that's all we want, and we know something is wrong. And therefore we then have our thyroid glands that help us base load in a manner that helps us establish what we call the basal metabolic rate, which I explained, which is just the business of keeping you alive. And then we have the adrenal gland that allows you to fine-tune that process. Now, think about this. Let me use myself as a good example. I used to compete a lot, and I remember, you go through emotional stages just before you get on stage, and there'll be times when your heart rate starts to increase. Why? Maybe in about 2 minutes is your time. You're getting on stage, and so there's that. You might say anxiety, worry, fear, and the body's doing one of many things. It's either releasing adrenals or it's releasing cortisol. Adrenal release occurs, say, from seconds to minutes, and I used to know exactly when my adrenaline started to increase, because perhaps it would be a few minutes before my competition time. But over time and with experience, I found I became a lot more calmer. Why? Because one of the things I had was confidence. I had experience. I had a history of failure and some successes. And therefore, I was no longer uncertain. I was uncertain about the outcome, but I wasn't uncertain about the process. Whereas the very first time I went for a martial arts competition, let me use that as a good example of the various competitions I have been involved in. Because it was my first time, people can explain how it might be, and you might visualize in your mind, but it was never the same as actually getting there. You're ready to go. And so I would find that I would be releasing adrenaline from seconds to minutes. But say 60 seconds into the fight, your heart rate would have spiked and suddenly starts to calm down, because now you're in process. You're in what we call the flow state. So you're not too bothered. Now, cortisol is what we release between minutes and hours. This is partly why for people who suffer from depression for whatever reason, for some people, it's environmental. As in the stimuli is environmental. You're not releasing adrenaline in a healthy dose, but you're releasing cortisol in a very unhealthy dose. This is why for some people in the work environment, or even at home, the environment is so uncertain, and the people you work around are so perhaps unsupported, that you find that you are always, constantly in a state of panic and worry and concern. Why? You're producing and releasing too much cortisol for an extended period, and the body cannot cope with that. Now, one of the best ways to regulate all that up and down goes back to diet. I'll go back to myself. Early days, I feasted on sugar and carbohydrates and starches because that was all I knew. But I exercised and I was involved in very high competitive sports. And so I would burn a lot of the sugars. And the younger you are, the younger I was, the more forgiving my body was. As I've gotten older, the less forgiving my body is. In any case, I found that I would have spikes in energy. So sometimes before I go for a competition, just before, I would need some form of sugar spike, something to give me that boost, because my body was releasing adrenaline. Diet plays a huge role. As a matter of fact, there's a therapeutic symbiosis between the diet, the nutritional supplements you are taking, and your mitochondria. And in sessions prior, I made reference to the fact that if you want to reduce on the physical side of things, not the spiritual or not the mental, but on the physical side, if you want to reduce any negative impacts that you might be feeling with regards to depression or anxiety, you have to start with your diet. You have to start with what you eat. And once you've gone through the process of getting your diet correctly, choosing to feed and fuel yourself rather than through glucose, to feed yourself and fuel yourself through ketones, which comes from fat and fiber, rather than carbohydrates and starches and sugars. What that causes or creates is a situation where the body's been fueled in the right way. It's like having the right fuel mix in the car, oxygen and fuel. The diet allows the acceleration which you need. The saber-toothed tiger pumps out, boom, you have enough energy. But more importantly, you have enough energy to sustain you for a longer period. For some people, they can do 100 meters in 10 seconds if a saber-toothed tiger were to appear. But they can only do that over a short distance. And anything beyond that goes into fatigue and depression. Whereas if you're fueling properly, then you have this therapeutic impact of diet, nutritional supplements, and your mitochondria. Your mitochondria is going fast, your supplement is allowing everything to function well, and your diet works as your base load. Depression, therefore, for most people is this clinical picture we see, where we have this imbalance between how the glands in the body function, your thyroid gland and your adrenal gland. And if one or both of them are not functioning well, what you then have is this confusion. The body's in a state of confusion because the body knows it's supposed to behave in a certain way, but it cannot because the organs that are supposed to be allowing the body function as if they should do not have the right fuel, or perhaps have been fed with the wrong fuel for too long and therefore there's a malfunction. I'll show you something perhaps that is interesting. A while back, I got one of these. This is simply, it's called a sample collection kit. It's a blood test kit. This has not been opened. This particular one has not been opened. Part of the reason I'm not trying to hold this steadily so you could see the manufacturer is simply because I'm not trying to advertise for the manufacturer. But some time ago, I decided to take matters into my own hand, which when I started with the whole process of, well, if I have to learn about how the body works and functions, then I have to do it properly. We learn in many ways. Someone has once said, you cannot manage what you do not measure. And so I made a decision that I would get my blood tests done, and I would measure my blood test every 3 to 6 months. All right, I would redo my blood test every 3 to 6 months. And the purpose of that was to actually look at all the results, monitor the results over a certain period of time, so I could understand how my diet and the nutritional supplements and all the regimes I mentioned, the detox regime and the exposure to sometimes you might even say cold immersion, will affect my test results. If you are struggling with depression, one of the best advices I can give you would be that you should get a blood test done. The key here is not to focus on every single aspect of what is measured. The focus really is to allow you to understand whether you have a thyroid or you have an adrenal function issue. One of the ways you do that is you get your blood test done, and it allows you to then sit down with pen and paper and review the ranges. There's a reference range, there's the population reference range. Generally speaking, this changes over time depending on how healthy the population is. In the UK, since the 1960s and 50s, our population reference ranges for various test results have been, you might say, watered down. We're no longer a very healthy nation. And so it's very important that you do not focus on the population reference range, but rather you focus on the individual range, because the individual range focuses on you. So for example, you might do a test and the range says, if you fall between 8 and 12, you're healthy. That's the population reference range. However, what if 70% of the population are unhealthy and fall within that range? and you used the population reference range as your benchmark, it would mean that you would be measuring yourself against a standard that was very low. So what we try to do is we try to get a clinical picture by virtue of trying to understand what the test results say, but even more importantly, how do you feel? This is where you do things such as you make observations about your body temperature. You make observations about with regards to your pulse rate. You make reference with regards to your blood pressure level. And then you consider that with regards to how you feel generally. Those who actually feel depressed most of the time will tell you they don't feel great. Or they might tell you that they go through cyclical phases. Sometimes they feel fine, and then there's a dump. And when they feel low, it's really, really, really bad. So by combining observations about that you can do yourself, temperature, pulse rates, blood pressure, and making observations about how you feel, you can then use that as a clinical diagnosis alongside the test results. And that gives you an idea. And here's the key part of today's session as I bring it to a close. It gives you an idea and provides this opportunity to see whether there's any issue about hypothyroidism. Are you hypothyroid? Now, it is my opinion, as I've studied this even more, and as I've interacted with professionals, and as I've tried to learn as much as I can, that most people who suffer from depression of any sort have a dysregulation with regards to thyroid or adrenal function. Most people are underactive. They have an underactive thyroid, which is one of the most clinically underdiagnosed issues or pathologies amongst most people in the West. Some professionals, for example, Dr. Kenneth Blanchard, states that in the West, he believes that more than 40% of people have the issue with regards to underactive thyroid, meaning it's not really diagnosed. The general practice in the medical profession, we're able to deal with when people are way over fatigued, and it can be seen through the tests. But what we fail to do is understand how to fine-tune the process or the gap in between when things are really, really slow, when things are really, really fast. And we mostly, purely also based on our Western diets and our lifestyles and our environments, we in the West, majority of people have an underactive thyroid. And the only way you go through the steps needed is to have a high index of suspicion, where you stop and say, well, maybe this does not apply to me, but let me apply the process of elimination. Let me start with the process of saying, okay, well, how do I feel? Great. Have I done the physical checks? Have I monitored the various signs and observations with regards to my body? And have I done a test? So I will leave you with this as I stop. If you struggle from fatigue, if you struggle from anxiety, if you struggle from depression, the best advice I can give you, or one of the best advice I would put on the table is this. There's a possibility that there is an adrenal or a thyroid gland issue. You might be underactive. But the only way you can actually find out if you are is to go through the process, get yourself a blood test. There are some DIY blood tests that you can do. Get a professional to take your blood, send it off to the companies, and they'll send back to you your test results. And here is perhaps the most empowering part of this whole journey. When people say that they are depressed, the people who suffer from depression tend to suffer alone, because there's no other person who feels what you feel. No one understands. Many empathize, and they can empathize with you because, you see, empathy is an embodied process. I can sit with you, and by virtue of the fact that I have intellectual faculties, I can try to put myself in your shoes, and I can empathize based on your physiology and your body language, and I can see that you hurt, but I would never know exactly how much you hurt. That you have to communicate, and your best communication to another always falls short of your true sufferings. Whereas by doing the test and making sure you have in front of you the results, it gives you this opportunity to recognize that perhaps rather than depend on clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, um, behavioral therapists, doctors, endocrinologists, rather than look to others to help explain how you feel, you can take the data or the information and you can start to make sense and you can start to write your own masterpiece of what the problem could be, rather than go down into this spiral of unhappiness and feeling that the world doesn't understand you, because the world doesn't understand. It's a fallacy. You know, people should understand. The world cannot understand, and therefore the world doesn't owe you understanding. The world is not patient. The world is not waiting for you to get through your crisis, wherever that might be. The world just carries on. And for those who actually suffer from depression, there's a sense that no one really cares. But that's not really true. People do care, but people don't get to walk in your shoes. And so people don't really understand how much you are truly suffering. Whereas if you were able to take matters into your hand and actually get the results yourself, do your test, study this whole concept of energy delivery and energy generation and mechanisms, and recognize that with good diet, with the right supplements, with a properly functioning mitochondria, your energy delivery mechanism within your body will improve drastically. For some people, so much so that you would not need any further assistance. For some other people, it might be that uncovering and going through those initial steps brings you to a place of you recognizing that partly one of the issue or the major issue could be your glands, that there is some help you need, either because your thyroid glands are not functioning as they should, or your adrenal glands are not functioning as they should. I hope today's session has been useful.